Hi, I'm Tara, 32, and I watched my parents order my golden child brother to seize the house I'd just bought. Then, last spring break, they drilled the locks and tried to move in. It started with a phone call, a casual Tuesday morning call, the kind you take on autopilot while your coffee brews. My mother's voice, sweet as poison. She said they were just going to check on the place. An hour later, my neighbor sent me a photo. A moving truck was parked in my brand new driveway. My driveway. So I ask myself now, looking back on all the wreckage, how can code mend a cracked family? For 5 years, home was an ex-warehouse camper parked in the backyard of a rental I shared with 3 other people. It squatted there in the grass like a scar I refused to hide, a 20-foot aluminum promise to myself. People thought it was a step down, a sign I'd failed somehow. But inside that tin can, I was the queen of my own world. It was my escape pod from a life of trying to be seen, of trying to be enough for a family that only measured worth in square footage and marriage certificates. I debug logistics apps for a living. I sit in front of a dual-monitor glow, untangling knots in code that sends packages across the country. It's a world of pure logic. If this, then that. No gray areas, no emotional blackmail. Just clean, predictable systems. My job is 2 miles from the camper, a short drive that felt like commuting between planets. Planet Logic and Planet Me. In the evenings, after a day of fixing other people's broken systems, I'd come back to my silver pod, put Ray Charles on the little CD player, and listen to the coffee pot gurgle for tomorrow's fight. That was my ritual. Coffee, code, and Ray. Who else was there to sing me to sleep? My pulse stalls. Because right then, I was happy. Or something close to it. I was saving. Every single paycheck, a huge chunk went into an account I nicknamed Escape Velocity. For 5 years, I ate cheap, said no to vacations, and patched the camper's leaky roof with tar and hope. The house wasn't just wood and drywall. It was my declaration of independence. A quiet, 3-bedroom ranch on a street with actual oak trees. It was the anti-camper. It was proof. I thought it would be proof they could finally be proud of. The day I closed, I posted a picture on Facebook. Me, grinning like an idiot, holding up a shiny brass key. The caption was simple, home. The first comment was from my mother. 5 words. That's cute, honey. For you. Cute. Not congratulations. Not we're so proud. Cute. Like a child's macaroni art project taped to the fridge. I was at my parents' house for dinner a few days later, and she said it again, laughing to my father. Isn't it cute? Her little mortgage. For a woman with no kids, I guess it's a nice little hobby. He just grunted, not looking up from the TV. What else would she downplay? My career? My life? My sanity? I just smiled, the way I always did. The validation addict in me, the little girl who still lived in my chest, whispered that if I just stayed quiet, if I just kept smiling, one day the praise would come. One day, they'd see me. Time locks up. Because right then, the monster was showing its face, and I was pretending it was just a shadow. A week later, my doorbell rang. It wasn't one person. It was a stampede. My parents, my brother Dan, his wife, and their 2 kids. They tumbled into my foyer like they owned the place. We were in the neighborhood. My mom chirped, her eyes scanning everything, judging everything. Before I could even offer them a drink, Dan's wife pulled a tape measure from her purse. A tape measure. She clicked it open and started measuring the wall in the living room. Dan followed her, nodding seriously. Yeah, the sectional would fit here, he said, but we'd have to move that outlet. His wife winked at me. A conspiratorial, chilling wink. Why would you measure someone else's walls? I stood there, frozen in my own hallway, a guest in my own house. My mother put her arm around me. Don't be difficult, Tara, she whispered, a smile plastered on her face. Dan needs a bigger place for the kids. You understand. Family first. I stopped breathing. Because right then, I realized they weren't visiting. They were scouting. Surveying. They were drawing up battle plans on my freshly painted walls. The air grew thick and heavy. I felt like I was drowning. My voice came out as a squeak. What are you doing? My father, who hadn't said a word, finally spoke. He clapped his hands together, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. "We've thought about this a lot," he announced, as if he were a CEO unveiling a new corporate strategy. "It makes sense. Dan gets the house. It's better for the family. You can have your camper back. You were so happy there." They saw my happiness not as a state of being, but as a justification for keeping me small. My little camper. My cute little life. Perfectly contained, so it wouldn't get in the way of my brother's grand destiny. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them to get out. To take their tape measures and their entitlement and their suffocating definition of family and burn it all. But the validation addict, that desperate ghost inside me, was still in charge. I just stood there, mute, as they mapped out their invasion. When they left, my mom hugged me at the door. "Think about it, honey," she said. "Be reasonable." The next day, the text came. A 1-week ultimatum. A picture of a calendar with a date circled in red. The text underneath it read, "Be reasonable, honey, family first." I stared at the screen at those 3 words. Family first. It wasn't a motto. It was a weapon. And it was pointed right at my heart. My pulse stalls. Because right then, I knew reasonableness had nothing to do with it. This was about power. And I had none. For the next week, I lived in a fog. I went to work, debugging code, my fingers flying across the keyboard while my mind was a million miles away, trapped in that house. I slept in the camper, which was still parked in the backyard of the new house, a strange umbilical cord to my old life. The gurgle of the coffee pot sounded like a countdown. Each morning, I'd wake up and check my phone, half expecting, half dreading another message. Silence. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a predator waiting. I'd walk through the empty rooms of the house, touching the walls they had measured. I felt like a ghost. Was I being selfish? The question echoed in my head, a drumbeat of doubt planted by my mother. Maybe they were right. Dan had kids. I had a job and a camper. In their ledger, the math was simple. His needs outweighed mine. My want was just a cute little hobby. I spent hours scrolling through old family photos, searching for a time when I felt like I belonged, when their love didn't feel conditional. I found nothing but pictures of me on the edge of the frame, smiling too brightly, a satellite in orbit around the sun that was my brother. The validation addict was screaming inside me. "Just give them the house," it shrieked. "They'll finally love you. They'll finally say they're proud. You'll finally be a good daughter." The thought was so tempting. The idea of laying down the burden, of finally getting that approval I'd craved my entire life. It was a siren song. Just surrender. Just let them win. I freeze. Because right then, on the last day of the ultimatum, I made a decision. I wouldn't reply. I would let the deadline pass. I would let my silence be the answer. I thought it was an act of defiance. I was so naive. I thought the battle was one of words of persuasion. I didn't realize they had already moved on to tools. It was a Wednesday. Spring break. I was at work, deep in a complex debugging sequence. My phone buzzed. It was my neighbor again. "Tara, you need to get home. Now." There was no photo this time, just urgency in her text. I made an excuse, grabbed my bag, and ran out of the office. The 15-minute drive felt like an eternity. My heart hammered against my ribs. What now? What could they possibly be doing now? When I turned onto my street, I saw it. The moving truck. The same one from the photo. It was backed all the way up my driveway, its ramp down like a grotesque tongue lolling out onto my lawn. My brother, Dan, was standing there, waving at the movers as they carried a huge box labeled Master Bed. He waved. He actually waved at them, a big, confident, homeowner wave. My blood went cold. I parked across the street, my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn off the ignition. I got out of the car. And then I saw my mother. She was standing on my porch, holding a cordless drill. I started walking, my legs feeling like they were made of concrete. As I got closer, I heard it. A high-pitched, metallic shriek. It was the sound of a drill bit chewing through metal. Through my new lock set. Sight. The truck, the boxes, my brother directing traffic in my driveway. Cardboard castles rising up in my living room. visible through the now open door. Sound. The horrific screech of the drill, my mother's voice, sharp and commanding, "Just do it for Dan." She was telling my father, who was the one actually operating the drill. Then, the sickening clink of the deadbolt giving way, of the knob breaking free. Touch. The asphalt under my sneakers, the car key digging into my palm, the cold, sick feeling of violation that washed over me in a wave. I was there. I was right there, 20 feet away, and they were breaking into my house like common thieves. I stopped breathing. Because right then, whose name was on the deed? Whose signature was on the mortgage documents I had spent 5 years of my life working for? They saw the house not as mine, but as a family asset they had the right to reallocate. My father pulled the ruined doorknob off and tossed it into the flower bed. He didn't even look at me. He just stepped inside, my mother following him, the drill still in her hand. My brother saw me then. He didn't look ashamed. He looked annoyed. Annoyed that I was there to witness his triumph. Annoyed that I was ruining the moment. That was the shatter. The moment every illusion I ever had about my family, about their love, about my place in it, turned to dust. The validation addict inside me went silent. It wasn't dead, but it was dying. And in its place, something cold and hard and clear began to grow. Steel. My pulse stalls. Because right then, I stopped being their daughter and became an owner. I stood on the sidewalk, the world tilting on its axis. The roar in my ears was deafening. My first instinct, the old instinct, was to run over there and scream, to cry, to demand they see what they were doing to me. But the new, cold thing in my gut held me back. Screaming was what they expected. Tears were what they fed on. It would just be more proof of my unreasonable nature. So I did the one thing they wouldn't expect. I stayed calm. I pulled out my phone. My hands were still shaking, but my finger was steady as I tapped the screen. I dialed 911. I kept my voice low even. "Yes, I'd like to report a break-in. It's in progress." I gave the dispatcher my address. My address. "Yes, I'm the homeowner. The people breaking in, they're my family." I put the phone on speaker, holding it down by my side, but angled just enough so the microphone could pick up everything. Then I walked across the street. Not running. Walking. A slow, deliberate pace. Each step felt heavy final. My sister-in-law saw me coming, saw the phone in my hand. Her face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, curdled into panic. She ran out onto the porch to meet me. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You call the cops on family? On Dan? I will key your stupid pickup truck from end to end if you do this, Tara. I swear to God I will." I didn't say a word. I just let her talk. I let the phone record her threats, her entitlement, her fury that her perfect plan was being disrupted. Time locks up. Because right then, I was gathering evidence. I was building a case, not with emotion, but with facts. The logic from my job, the clean if this then that, was finally being applied to my own life. If they break the law, then there are consequences. It was that simple. Inside, I could hear my parents talking about where to put their furniture. My father's voice, booming, "The big screen goes here. Best view in the house." I walked up the 3 steps to my porch. I looked past my sputtering sister-in-law, through my broken door, and into the eyes of my mother. She was holding a box labeled kitchen. She saw the phone. She saw the look on my face. A look she had never seen before. The smile fell from her lips. "Tara," she said, her voice suddenly uncertain. "Don't be dramatic." "The police are on their way," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was flat. Cold. It was the voice of a stranger. "You have 5 minutes to get your things and get out of my house." My brother came to the door, his face red with anger. "Our father is helping me," he yelled. "This is a family matter." "It stopped being a family matter when you used a drill on my door," I replied, my eyes locked on his. "Now it's a criminal matter. Breaking and entering. Destruction of property. And you," I said, turning to my sister-in-law, uttering threats. I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. The steel in my spine grew a little thicker. For my entire life, I had traded my silence for the hope of a single, honest, "We're proud." I'd kept my peace, swallowed my feelings, made myself smaller and smaller, hoping that one day they'd notice my sacrifice and reward me for it. I finally understood. They didn't want my silence. They wanted my submission. And the price of their pride was my entire life. The sound of a siren grew in the distance. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The next few months were a special kind of hell. A cold war fought over text messages and passive-aggressive Facebook posts from my mother about ungrateful children and what's happened to family values. They didn't speak to me directly. Instead, they launched a campaign, calling every relative we had, spinning a tale of a selfish daughter who had a big empty house while her brother's beautiful family was cramped in a tiny apartment. I was painted as cruel, mentally unstable, and worst of all, ungrateful. The flying monkeys assembled, just as my parents knew they would. Aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in years started calling me, telling me to do the right thing, to make peace, to give Dan the house. The pressure was immense. The old validation addict inside me whimpered. It wanted to give in, to end the shunning, to be welcomed back into the fold. But the woman who called 911 on her own family held firm. The climax came, as it so often does in families like mine, at Christmas. Christmas Eve, to be exact. I knew they would try something. I was ready. I had installed security cameras. I had a new reinforced door. I was not hosting a party. I was sitting on my couch, listening to Ray Charles, when the doorbell rang. I looked at the monitor. It was my gossip-loving aunts. The vanguard. They were sent to soften the beachhead before the main force arrived. I let them in. They stormed into my living room, their faces grim, ready for a fight. "Tara, this has gone on long enough," one of them began. But before she could launch into her prepared speech, I held up a hand. "Please," I said calmly. "Sit down. Let me play you something." I connected my phone to the Bluetooth speaker. I played the 911 call. The dispatcher's calm voice. My own study report. And then, crystal clear, my sister-in-law's voice, screeching about keying my truck. The aunts fell silent. Their mouths hung open. I stopped breathing. Because right then, the narrative they had been fed began to crumble. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a crime. As the recording ended, the doorbell rang again. This time it was my parents, my brother, and his family. The main event. They pushed their way in, expecting to find me cornered and shamed by the aunts. Instead, they walked into an ambush. The living room had become an impromptu tribunal. And the jury, the gossip-loving aunts they had sent as their weapons, had flipped sides. Every flying monkey had turned. One of my aunts stood up, her face a mask of fury, and pointed a finger at my mother. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed. "You told us she threw you out. You didn't tell us you broke down her door." The room exploded. My mother started crying. My father started yelling. My brother tried to grab the speaker, to shut it off, but I was already there, holding it. My sister-in-law, realizing she had been exposed, completely lost it. She started screaming at me, at her husband, at her own mother-in-law. It was the ugliest, most beautifully validating chaos I had ever witnessed. It was the sound of a dynasty of delusion collapsing under the weight of a single, recorded fact. My pulse stalls. Because right then, I knew I had already won. The rest was just cleanup. The fight spilled out onto the lawn. It was biblical. My father, in a fit of rage at seeing his authority utterly dismantled, snatched the new set of house keys from my mother's purse, the ones I had foolishly given them for emergencies before all this started. He screamed something incoherent at me, something about how I'd never have a family, and then he hurled the keys with all his might. They sailed through the air in a perfect, spiteful arc and landed with a splash in the storm drain at the end of my driveway. That's when the police, called by the same neighbor who had become my guardian angel through all this, arrived for the second time. The flashing red and blue lights painted the whole insane Christmas tableau in strobes of red and blue. My sister-in-law was sobbing, her baby was wailing. My mother was trying to comfort her, while my brother just stood there, defeated. The officer took one look at the scene, listened to my aunt's breathless retelling of the break-in and the threats, and walked over to my father. He handed him a flashlight. "Sir," he said, his voice completely deadpan. "You need to retrieve the lady's keys." And so, on Christmas Eve, under the cold, unforgiving glare of police lights, I watched my father get down on his hands and knees. I watched him fish my house keys out of the oily, disgusting water of a storm drain while my relatives cheered. The officer looked at my brother and his wife, then at the moving boxes still stacked in their pickup truck. "Vacation's over," he said. "If hearing this story resonated with you, let me know you're here with a like or a comment." It was the payoff. The quiet, karmic justice you read about in books, but never expect to see in real life. It wasn't about revenge. It was about consequences. It was about the logical conclusion to an illogical series of actions. If you throw something away in anger, then you have to go pick it up. Simple as that. They were escorted off my property with a warning that if they ever set foot on it again, they would be arrested for trespassing. The war was over. That night, after everyone was gone, the silence in the house was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful. I made a pot of coffee, put on my Ray Charles record, and sat on the floor of my living room. The Christmas lights from the house across the street blinked through the window. For months, my life had been a series of alarms. The ping of a passive-aggressive Facebook post. The buzz of an angry text. The shriek of a drill bit. Now, all I could hear was the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the warm crackle of the vinyl spinning. I had mourned the loss of my family, the one I thought I had, the one I'd spent 32 years trying to please. But what I had lost was an illusion. What I had gained was myself. The camper sat in the backyard for another year. I couldn't bring myself to sell it. It was my touchstone, my reminder of where I came from and the strength I didn't know I had. It was the scar I was no longer ashamed of. The house slowly started to feel like a home. I painted the walls a calm, earthy green. I planted a small herb garden in the kitchen window. Watching a tiny basil sprout push its way out of the soil felt like a miracle. A quiet, determined act of life. It's been 5 years since that Christmas Eve. 5 years of blessed, uncomplicated silence from their side of the world. I hear things sometimes through the grapevine of my now loyal aunts. I know my brother and his wife did eventually buy a bigger house, burying themselves in debt to keep up appearances. I know my parents are older, quieter, living in a house full of bitterness. I don't feel anger towards them anymore. I don't feel much of anything. They are just characters in a story that's over. A story I survived. My life is calm now. It's my job, my house, my little garden, and my music. It's the gurgle of the coffee pot at dawn, a sound that no longer signals a fight, but simply a new day. My day. I've learned that you can't use logic to fix a system that's built on emotion. You can't debug a human heart. You can only protect your own code, build your own firewalls, and decide who gets access. My peace is non-negotiable now. The price of admission to my life is respect. It's the only currency that matters. Follow my journey and subscribe to see what comes next. Home blooms where respect lives.